Hello, this is Adrian Goldberg with a stop press before you listen to this week's Where's the Money Gone? This episode is partly about unpaid wages at Sheffield Wednesday. Now the podcast has been edited, the players have been paid, but a week late. And we think many of the points made in the pod still stand. As the Sheffield Star reports, the Owls paid the money on the last day possible. Any later, they would have breached the EFL's 30-day rule, which says that if a club defaults on payments for a period of 30 days or more in any 12-month period, they face disciplinary action, almost certainly a transfer embargo. Given that Wednesday have previously made late payments to HM Revenue and Customs, it seems they are walking a fine line. Anyway, enjoy. Hi there and welcome to Where's the Money Gone, a podcast about football, finance, governance and politics with me, Adrian Goldberg. I'm an investigative journalist, West Bromwich Albion season ticket holder, joined as usual by Charlie Methven, who can take us inside the boardroom after his experiences as a director of both Sunderland and Charlton Athletic. Charlie has also given advice to both Arsenal and Spurs. He is, amongst other things, now working in Jamaica with Mount Pleasant Football Club. So welcome, Charlie. A few things on our agenda this week. Sheffield Wednesday woe. The players' March wages are unpaid at the time of recording. Plus, should you get the boot if you commute? In a business where you can't really work from home, players' long-distance journeys to work are in the spotlight after a reported row between Leicester manager Ruud van Nistelrooy and Harry Winks. And Norway has voted to scrap VAR, but he's going to keep it anyway. So loads for us to be discussing. Let's talk about Sheffield Wednesday. Mr. Chansiri, the owner of Sheffield Wednesday, you must have had some dealings with him. A very Marmite character, I think it's fair to say, as far as Sheffield Wednesday fans are concerned. Maybe more than a Marmite character now. Probably a chairman who is very much in their sights as a fan group, I would suggest.
Well, actually, I haven't had any dealings with Dejphon Chansiri. I met him. This was back when I was working at Oxford, and we drew Sheffield Wednesday in the League Cup, second or third round, something like that, just after he'd taken over. And we went up, it was a Tuesday night game, we went up, had dinner, and so extremely pleasant man. He was very amiable and welcoming. And I know that sort of sounds trite, but that's not always the case in football boardrooms. Quite often, the owners of the other club busy themselves, whatever it is they're doing, sort of let you get on with it as a way directors. But that wasn't the way of him at all. He was extremely pleasant. Now that we're talking now, that was 10 years ago. That was 10 years ago when I was at Oxford. And over those 10 years, clearly there has been a roller coaster ride, as there often is in football club ownership. Fairly early on in the piece, Sheffield Wednesday got to the playoff final, and obviously therefore were within 90 minutes of getting back into the Premier League for the first time in quite a long time. And then they also got relegated to League One. When I do remember towards the back end of my time at Sunderland, they were in League One, and Sunderland beat them in the playoff semi-finals the year that we got promoted. And then, of course, they then did get promoted and back into the Championship. And again, some more roller coastery stuff went on. And eventually they happened upon a manager who's ended up being, an elite manager, or looking like he's going to be an elite manager, Danny Roll, who not only sort of got them clear of relegation last year, but got them into the top half of the table this year. Now, the reason I outline all that is that fan sentiment at clubs is an uneasy arm wrestle between the logic of analysing whether an owner is or isn't being a, quote, good owner, successful owner, and that's often driven by sort of medium-term views. Often the supporters' trust will be sort of asking questions about, well, what's your plan for the future? Let's have a look at our infrastructure, what's happening with the academy, and all this type of stuff. So there'll be some views being formed in the sort of more educated bits of the fan base as to whether an owner is or isn't a good owner. And then you have the brute reality of results. And results are what drives the emotions of the broad, sort of, particularly the noisier bits of the fan base, which means that sometimes somebody who is a good owner can be attacked as a bad owner, let's say as Daniel Levy currently is at Spurs, because there are a few bad results. And sometimes it can mean that a bad owner gets away with being a bad owner because there are some short-term good results that takes the attention of the fan base away from what is plainly happening underneath their noses. Now, I think whilst I wouldn't sort of, as I said, Dejphon Chansiri seemed to me to be a very amiable guy, that the pattern of what seems to have happened over the last 10 years is that there's never actually been a plan at Sheffield Wednesday. He's actually spent a lot of money. He's spent £150 million during his tenure there. Now, if you think that championship clubs in theory are only allowed to lose £13 million a year, he's been right at the end, right at the sort of the thick end of allowable losses throughout his tenure at Sheffield Wednesday. And that money has been spent on players and I guess sacking managers and all the rest of it, because very little money has been spent on Hillsborough or on their training facilities or on their academy. So in some ways, Dejphon, has lived out the mug punter fan fantasy, which is don't worry about all that stuff. Don't worry about having a plan. Don't worry about doing up the stadium. Just buy a striker, man. Just go and buy a striker. And Dejphon Chansiri has bought a lot of strikers. But there was never a plan. There was never a plan. And unfortunately, when there is never a plan and there is no idea about how you're going to differentiate yourselves from your peers, you end up spending more and failing more in the medium to long run. And that's where the whole sorry tale has now ended up, which is effectively you've got a situation where £150 million in with a club that's probably now worth around about 60 to 70 million pounds. So Dejphon is now, £90 million in the red on this particular transaction. And for whatever reasons going on inside his own family business empire, he now finds himself unable to pay the wages. And therefore, suddenly, all of those fears and suspicions that the more educated parts of the Sheffield Wednesday fan base has had over the last few years come bubbling back to the surface again, despite the fact that on the playing side, they've had a perfectly respectable season.
They are a club who, from an away fan perspective, I would say, are not loved. And I say this with all due respect to both Sheffield Wednesday and Sheffield United, because I love the city of Sheffield. It's always, as a fan, one of my favourite away cities to visit. And I mentioned on my West Brom podcast, The Liquidator, recently, going to Kelham Island, which is a great little drinking quarter in Sheffield, and meeting some Wednesday fans there, one of whom popped out to the local shops and bought me a bottle of Henderson's Relish so that I wouldn't forget my trip to Sheffield. It was lovely. But that was at Hillsborough, which, as you say, is a ground that appears not to have been significantly revamped since the early 90s. Away fans pay £33, which is maybe not outrageous for a championship fixture, but was certainly in the upper range of tickets. And I think supporters who were buying individual match day tickets for the Steel City Derby Wednesday against United were asked to pay £54 for that. So it's a club that is not loved by outsiders. Now, that may not matter particularly to Sheffield Wednesday fans, but now with players, and this has been acknowledged by the club, not being paid on time, apparently according to the club, it's because of issues in Chansiri's business, in his other businesses, there is a real risk that they will be handed a 3-window transfer embargo. I mean, that's really potentially quite crippling for that club.
So, personally, I think Sheffield Wednesday is great. I think it's one of the great clubs of our country. Top 10 in my view. The atmosphere in Hillsborough when it gets going is phenomenal. The loyalty of the fan base is fantastic. As you say, it's a great city. And I've always just had this feeling that it's just a bigger club than Sheffield United, really, with more potential. But that said, yes, the way in which Dejphon has been running the club over the last few years has been erratic, to say the least. Now, it's just when we talk about ticketing, it's worth bearing in mind that Chansiri and his management put the season tickets on sale in December. Now, most football clubs do put their season tickets on sale in around about March, April time, around about now. And the reason for that is to gather together some cash to sustain the club during the summer months when there's no other revenue coming in. So, you stop having home matches. So you stop getting your match-to-match revenue, you stop getting your food and beverage revenue, you stop getting a lot of your merchandise revenue dies down unless you're doing a shirt launch, etc. So effectively, during June and July, you need, or May, June and July, if you're not in the playoffs, you need some cash to keep you going. So the season ticket money sustains you through the summer. So that's the validity of why clubs do go on sale a bit early, because often fans say to me, well, why don't you just put season tickets on sale at the end of the season? Well, because we need some money during that close season time. Okay, so why is he putting season tickets on sale, or why is his management putting season tickets on sale in December? That can only be because they are worried about cash flow in January, February and March. Now, Sheffield Wednesday have a lot of season ticket holders. And I've been doing some back of the fag packet calculations, and by my reckoning, they are receiving around about £5 million in revenue from season tickets. And that £5 million would have been coming in December. And then in January, you also get your second payment from the Football League, your solidarity payment from the Football League. So effectively, by early January, that club would have received £6 million plus. It's then also received the match-to-match revenue in January, February and March, which is a busy time with lots and lots of matches. So I'm going to be conservative and say that £7 to £8 million of revenue has come into Sheffield Wednesday in the last 3 months, right? Now, for the club to have literally run out of money by mid-March, which effectively is what we're talking about here, because they haven't been able to meet payroll on sort of March the 22nd or whatever it might be, 23rd or 24th, basically means that all of that money has gone. Now, the danger of that situation is that we're just approaching the time of year when money runs short at all clubs, which, as I said, is May, June and July. So if you can't pay your wages in March, you've got big problems as a club. You've got severe problems. Now, the Football League will be looking at this and will be speaking to the executives of the club, asking them, what's the plan? Because we can see that the plan for paying March is hoping that Dejfon's other companies somehow recover some money that they're owed. But how does that deal with May, June and July? So what we can't have you do is signing players. We can't have you going out and making promises to players that you're going to be able to pay them when you can't even pay your current players, right? So this is a moment of crisis in Chansiri's ownership of the club. It's not quite the same situation that Dai Yong has been in at Reading, because Chansiri has kept up a steady stream of communication with the fans over the course of his tenure, and he hasn't gone AWOL like Dai has. But it may be worth remembering that just over a year ago, I think a year and a half ago, when fans were complaining about the state of the club as a whole, Chansiri suggested that if they wanted the club to improve, that perhaps they should pay the bills. So this has been a dispute that's been simmering for a little while. It's been a situation that's been coming to the boil for a little while. And it seems now that the brute reality of cash flow has brought the situation right to the table. Now, of course, transfer embargo is one thing, but there will be those who will be saying that this is actually a points deduction matter, and that this is happening in full season. Now, if you think about the championship table right now, which I'm just going to pull up, and I know it's a table of pain for you right now, Adrian, so I'm not going to linger on the top half of the table. I'm going to look at the bottom half of the table, because I think that Sheffield Wednesday have just slid into the bottom half of the table. They are on 52 points after 40 games. It looks like, for safety, it's going to be about 46 or 47 points. So they're not that far above the relegation zone. And if you were a club like Cardiff or Derby, you might very well say, well, Sheffield Wednesday have been paying their players more than they can afford, and they are now unable to pay them. But the points that they have accrued during that time are the points that are going to keep them above us in the table. And therefore, we think there should be a points deduction here. We think that Sheffield Wednesday should be relegated. So this is and of course, points deductions for non-payment of wages have been made in the past. This is not an unlikely event. The transfer embargo is inevitable and logical, because you can't sign players when you can't pay your own players. But I would just keep a wary eye on that points deduction argument. It's not impossible, particularly as the weeks go by, because I think you started off the pod by saying that they were paying their players late. Well, actually, they haven't paid them yet. So at the moment, it's not a question of late payment; it's non-payment. Now, that's something where
I think late payment is how they would characterise it. Whether it turns into non-payment in the long term remains to be seen. But you're right.
But the Professional Footballers Association, the Professional Footballers Association will be quite clear that payment of your players' wages is a base fundamental of your ability to retain your license. Now, this is when we do have to have a look at the Reading situation, because I think the Reading situation is interesting in one regard, which is the Football League has really flexed its muscles on Reading and has said to the Reading owner, you have to sell now, or else effectively we're going to take the situation out of your hands. Now, I wonder how long this situation at Wednesday is going to have to develop before at some point the Football League says something similar to Dejphon Chansiri. You can't carry on being a Football League owner if you can't pay your wages. And I said that I say that with all due respect, because Dejphon Chansiri has spent a vast amount of money on Sheffield Wednesday, and Sheffield Wednesday being mid-table in the Championship is not some horrible disgrace. He hasn't got them relegated out the whole Football League or anything like that. But it does feel like matters are coming to a pass.
Yeah, well, you and I sing from the same hymn sheet here, Charlie. The nonsense of allowing clubs to be run in such an unsustainable way over such a long period. Unsustainable in the sense that they rely on sugar daddy owners. They rely on people like Chansiri to keep shoveling money in, putting more fuel on the fire season after season in the hope of getting to the Premier League. And then when there's no more fuel to put on that fire, the risk that the flame will go out altogether. And yet this is a football club that regularly attracts more than 26,000 fans. It is, as you say, a magnificent fan base in a fabulous city. It actually doesn't need Chansiri's money, but it shouldn't
need Chansiri's money.
Well, indeed. Yeah,
if we just have and part of the reason why it does need Chansiri's money is Chansiri and his lack of a plan. But putting that to one side, if we actually look at Sheffield Wednesday's revenues, they're not far short of £30 million a year, right? We're talking about 27, 28 million pounds a year, something like that. Because they are so well, it's such a big club, a huge club, that even without parachute payments, they're still in the top half of revenue earners in the Championship. Now, if I was looking at that as a chief executive, saying, right, I've got £30 million to play with here. Okay, the operational expenses of the club, maybe £10 million, and the non-playing wages of other academy staff and these types of people and people at Hillsborough, another £3 million, something like that. £3 to £4 million maybe. You've still got, even after all that, you've got 13 to 14 million pounds to play with, to pay players with, and still stay within within your budgets, or maybe be over by a couple of million or something like that. And that's how it should be. But somehow Sheffield Wednesday has got itself over the last 10 years into a doom loop of signing experienced, expensive players who have had good careers, who are still on massive money, who are on their one last paycheck sort of moment in time. And you do need some of those players around in the Championship, and there's no doubt about it. You need some people who know how the Championship works, how it operates. Do you need to have an entire squad full of them, including the substitutes bench? Probably not. You also need to have some young players coming through who not only give you a bit of legs and energy in the team, but also who are potentially saleable, and who then once every 2 or 3 years, you get your £20 million, 15, £20 million transfer, which then helps the whole thing go round and round and round. And that's how most Championship clubs operate. Bristol City would be a very good example of that kind of mix. West Brom, likewise, a good example of that kind of mix. Sheffield Wednesday just seem not to have had that focus on either the academy or on a recruitment system which enables them to attract bright young players cheaply, which then pushes you onwards and upwards. It's all expensive older players.
Indeed. Well, listen, we send our best wishes to Sheffield Wednesday supporters. And as I say, they are a great fan base. I love Sheffield as a city, and I hope a solution can be found that may involve selling the club. But unless the club is sold, you do fear the worst for Wednesday in the short term, at least. Want to talk as well about commuting footballers, Charlie. I don't know what experience you've had on this, but the
A
Telegraph.
lot,
Oh,
a
good.
lot.
The Telegraph reported that Ruud van Nistelrooy, who at the time of recording this has lost 14 of his last 15 games as Leicester City manager, he's had tussles that have been reported with one or two players about their commutes. And the latest one to erupt is between him and Harry Winks. Now, Winks is based in Hertfordshire, former Spurs player, of course, and has got a 100-mile commute to Leicester's training ground. And it's been reported that as a result of refusing to compromise on that, Winks has been dropped from the team. Winks was apparently invited to spend just one night a week at the club's training ground, which is pretty plush by all accounts. He's got a child on the way, which is news he posted on social media. So he refused to budge on that issue, and presumably he'd been given permission to do that by previous managers. So there we are. I mean, how do you manage that situation as a club?
Well, it's extremely difficult because contractually, footballers' contracts are templated effectively. It's a trade unionized industry. The contracts are effectively done in negotiation with the Professional Footballers Association. You fill in the gaps, X amount per week, X amount bonus, X amount this Y, release clause X, Y, et cetera, et cetera. So these are quite sort of just normative contracts that don't vary very much from player to player. And there isn't really legally, contractually that much right to say we are going to employ you and we are also going to insist on your living arrangements. When you think about it in a normal job situation, that would be quite rare. You can certainly insist that people turn up at a certain time, and that is very much a part of a footballer's contract, and governed by both an internal fine system and then ultimately breach of contract situation. But in terms of where you actually live, it's difficult, and sometimes even during a contract negotiation, the question might be asked to the player, well, where do you plan to live? Oh, absolutely, I plan to live in Leicester. And then 6 months later, you find that quietly the player involved never actually did move to Leicester and has been commuting 100 miles each way every single day. This actually happened to us at Sunderland in the infamous Will Grigg transfer, which, as well related on Netflix, was a very last minute type of thing. So I'm not even sure that any particular blame pertains to Will Grigg in this situation. But anyhow, it turned out that Will was commuting from Birmingham. Now, I think eventually he was persuaded to get something small in Sunderland so that he could occasionally stay up there. But Birmingham to Sunderland is a much greater commute than Hertfordshire to Leicester. And, of course, one does wonder whether his time at Sunderland and his overall level of form at Sunderland was somewhat conditioned by the amount of travelling he was doing, because we're talking here about athletes who are being asked to perform at the very limit of what physiology suggests is possible in terms of the amount that they are allowed to run, expected to run, the amount of power output they're expected to be able to give on the pitch and therefore on the training pitch beforehand. These athletes are being, particularly at the elite level, are being pushed to the very, very limits, why you're seeing so many soft tissue injuries in the game in this day and age. And as we discussed before, there are so many fixtures, as well. So in other words, things like rest and recovery, and things like how a player activates before a training session, these have become quite central topics of conversation within football clubs because of the amount of soft tissue injuries, and also just the extent to which even very minor changes in players' diets and sleeping patterns can make the difference between whether they actually are on top form or if they're not on top form. So if you look at it from Van Nistelrooy's point of view, he's trying to enable a culture within that club, which is about commitment, which is about fitness, which is about giving everything to the cause, all the things that he would have learnt at Man United under Fergie, etc. And then he finds out that he's got players who are basically putting their own performance at risk with huge driving distances every single day, which is, particularly bad in a physical job. It's not great in a non-physical job, but in a physical job, it's particularly bad. So you're turning up at the training ground on time, so you're meeting your contract, but you've just spent 2 hours in a crunched up position in a car, and you're pretty much getting straight out of that car into an elite training environment. That just, no one would suggest that is an ideal situation to be in. So I can see it from Van Nistelrooy's point of view, but from the player's point of view, he will say, I am meeting my contractual obligations. It is up to the coach whether he picks me or not. I'm a professional person. I'm turning up on time. I'm fulfilling my side of the contract.
Yeah, indeed. And I think I said Winks had said he got a child on the way. In fact, he's announced the birth of a baby girl a few days ago. So our congratulations to him on that. And of course, as you say, Charlie, there's got to be consideration given to how healthy it is for the player to be sitting bunched up in a car, travelling 100 miles, or, Will Griggs' case, the 250 miles between Birmingham and Sunderland when he played for your club at that time. But you've also got to give consideration, don't you, as a club, to the mental well-being of a player, to just how happy and contented they are. So if they're going back home every night and they've got a domestic situation that satisfies them, they may be there to help as a parent, in Wink's case with a newborn child and so on, that mental well-being is also part of the calculation for the coach and for the club.
Yeah, well, that's a fact and all. You can ultimately you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. As I said, there's no contractual obligation for a player to live in a certain place. That's not the way it works. So therefore, when a player says, I'm going to be living with my partner and my young family because that's what I need for my own mental health, I'm going to meet my contractual obligation, there's not much really that you can do about it. I think as a club, it would be quite unusual for you to say, well, we're worried about your mental sort of state, so we do believe that you should be commuting 100 or 200 miles a day. That would be an unusual step to take. But I think at the same time, there is obviously a recognition that these are sporting organisations and other people do have other life concerns. And it very often is about a young family. Because I think the one thing to recognise on the player side is that these players very often are moving club once every couple of years. But the young family cannot be expected to move once every year or two. So once they start to get put into kindergarten and school and all this type of stuff, it would be immensely disruptive to be just moving them every single time that daddy got to move to a different football club. So very often the wife will say, look, we need to find our base, wherever it might be, somewhere in the middle of the country. And then you can go off and be a professional footballer, wherever it is that you're going to be a professional footballer, and we'll work out the living arrangements as we go in terms of where you will be the father in the situation, but equally we would want you to be at home as much as you possibly can be, and that's a perfectly normal thing that most fathers and most families would recognize. But elite sport is not really about this. Elite sport is about sacrifices. Elite sport is about trying to be the best you absolutely possibly can. And you can see from Van Nistelrooy's point of view, given the situation that he's found Leicester in, and you say he's lost 14 of his last 15 games, but he's caught a falling knife there. That club has been on the road to this situation for quite some time. It's not been well run for quite some time. And he's trying to turn the whole thing round, and he needs to have everyone with their shoulder to the wheel and everyone pushing and pulling in the right direction, and having even one or two players in the dressing room who are putting other priorities first, of course, sends a message to the other players, particularly the younger players in the squad, about where your priorities lie, and that can be extremely unhelpful. So sometimes a manager will decide, I need to make an example here. I need to try and demonstrate to the squad as a whole that I'm serious about this.
Yeah, and the demand on the face of it for Winks to spend just one night a week at the training ground doesn't sound terribly unreasonable, does it? You might say it's unreasonable to expect a player to live in the city, particularly if they've got a young family, when there is a reasonable commute to be done. But to request it for one night a week sounds to me perhaps as though the manager is setting a challenge to the player, just testing them out, really. And
because it's worth bearing in mind the rhythms of the training week, right? So generally speaking, the training week, players will come in on a Monday for a sort of a bit of a post-match analysis. They'll be off on the Sunday normally. Come in on the Monday for a bit of post-match analysis and a sort of gentle training session. Tuesday will then be a heavy training session, and they'll have Wednesday off. So you might very well say, if you're the manager, look, just give me Monday night. I want you to be right on form on the Tuesday. After training on Tuesday, you can go back home. You've got Wednesday off anyway. You can come back up on Thursday morning. That's absolutely fine. But give me Tuesday night. Monday night. That would be a perfectly reasonable suggestion for Van Nistelrooy to make. I want you at your best on that Tuesday training session. And it does seem like a reasonable enough request, but equally, as I said, contractually, the player does not have to comply with that.
I think there might be one or two moles in that Leicester City squad as well. There was a story earlier this season about Yannick Vestergaard, who hasn't played for Leicester's first team since February. Vestergaard was photographed walking his family's dog outside Leicester's training ground, was given permission to bring the dog to training because he had no family members who were at home at that time able to take the dog for a walk. I mean, it does speak of perhaps a rather too cosy relationship between the players and perhaps their previous manager Enzo Maresca, and that Van Nistelrooy is trying to drive a little bit more hardness and professionalism into that setup. Anyway, we'll see. Just want to briefly address the question of VAR. We might return to a deeper conversation about VAR in a future episode, Charlie, because I think it's something that exercises fans a lot, particularly on football phone-ins. But Norway wanted to get rid of VAR. In Sweden, in their top division, they don't have VAR. In Norway, the majority of clubs, 19 out of 32 in their top divisions, voted to get rid of VAR. But the Norwegian Football Federation, the equivalent of the FA in Norway, got a vote together, but they enlisted the help of all the clubs in the Norwegian Football Federation. So those who don't use VAR, and collectively they voted to keep VAR in the top division. It's kind of a strange situation. I hate VAR, let me just stress. And I'm not against all technology in football. I totally respect goal line technology. That's brilliant. I could even hear an argument for the kind of semi-automated offside VAR. I could hear an argument for that. But VAR as it's operated in the Premier League is horrible, I think.
Well, I totally agree with you. I absolutely agree. And every poll that's done of fans say that that they don't like VAR. And I think the main thing that it robs is of the moment of being able to celebrate a goal and just knowing that you can just celebrate and just be in that moment, which is such a massive part of being a football fan, is celebrating that moment. And it's got to the point now where the celebrations have to be, massive asterisks against them pretty much in every single occasion, because the fans know that there is a 20 to 30% chance it's going to get referred to VAR for some reason, often something which has happened in the build-up to the goal or whatever it might be. So I absolutely can't stand VAR. Goal line technology is just obvious, that's just a scientific metrical thing. Offside is arguable either way, and I'm concerned about the huge delays that are caused with checking the offside, again, the flow of the game. But that's something which perhaps could get quicker. But really, anything else has to be left for me with the umpire on the pitch. The moment you start saying that the umpire on the pitch can be second guessed by somebody else who's still a human being, right, sat in some TV booth somewhere else, I just don't see it. I just don't see how that's added any enjoyment to our game whatsoever. Quite the opposite.
Okay, well, so we might discuss that in greater detail in a future episode. You referenced Ruud van Nistelrooy catching a falling knife. It sounds to me like you're in your kitchen. You might be catching a few falling knives yourselves if you don't wrap them shortly, Charlie. But such are the pitfalls and the pleasures of recording podcasts when we work from home and we don't have to do those long commutes. But listen, thanks very much as always. We'll be back again next week. Before we go, just to say thank you to Jed Thomas, who handles some of the production duties on this podcast, and Mark Machado at 1129 Media, who works on our socials, and will be working on getting Charlie a much improved video. We'll recognise that it's not as pristine as it needs to be, but Charlie's onto that. So Mark, we know that needs to be done. And if you're interested in reading more about this, then do check out my forthcoming book called Where's the Money Gone? I run a Substack called Goldberg at Large, adriangoldberg.substack.com, where I post extracts of my forthcoming book called Where's the Money Gone? I think the baby needs attending to, Charlie. I'll see you again.
Thank you, Adrian.
Take care. See you later.
Thank you. Bye.